You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. My name is Tom Miller, and I'm recording this from a place that doesn't appear on any map, in a time that exists between seconds. What I'm about to tell you happened 4 months ago, though time itself has become negotiable since then. They say the Vatican keeps secrets that would shatter the human mind. They're wrong. The secrets keep themselves, and the Vatican just tries to manage the fallout. I used to believe in facts, clean, verifiable truth that you could touch and measure and prove to skeptics. Before that, I'd spent 4 years in seminary, studying to become a priest, until the weight of unanswered questions drove me to seek truth in journalism instead of faith. I specialised in religious mysteries, the kind of stories that made editors nervous and readers obsessed. That was my life until November 15th, when a package arrived that would teach me the difference between truth and truth, between reality and reality, between the questions we ask and the answers that ask us back. I was working late in my Chicago apartment, a cramped studio that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. The November wind rattled my windows with unusual persistence, as if something outside was trying to get in. I'd been staring at a half-finished article about Vatican finances for 4 hours, the cursor blinking mockingly on an empty page. My rent was 3 weeks overdue, my editor had stopped returning calls, and I was seriously considering a career change to something more stable, like professional gambling. That's when I heard them. Footsteps, not the usual sounds of my building, Mrs. Chen from 3B heading to a night shift, or the college kids upstairs playing their music too loud. These were different, heavy, deliberate, with a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. They climbed the 4 flights to my floor with mechanical precision, stopped directly outside my door, and waited. I held my breath, listening. No knock came, no voice called out, just the sound of something being placed carefully on my doormat, followed by those same deliberate footsteps retreating down the stairs. When I finally worked up the courage to open my door, the hallway was empty, except for a brown paper package sitting exactly in the center of my threshold. The package felt ancient in my hands. The paper wasn't really paper at all, but something that felt more like parchment or vellum, tied with string that looked hand-braided. There was no return address, no postal markings, no indication of how it had travelled from wherever it came from to my door. Just my name, written in careful script with what appeared to be fountain pen ink that had an odd, iridescent quality in the hallway light. Inside, nested in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch, were 3 objects that would redefine my understanding of reality. A piece of ancient manuscript, covered in Latin text and intricate drawings, a brass key with Vatican insignia that felt warm despite having been wrapped in paper, and a letter containing a single line in the same iridescent ink. They buried the truth. You deserve to see it. Finish what Paul started. The manuscript was extraordinary. Not parchment, as I'd first thought, but something else entirely. A material that seemed to shift between paper and fabric, and something organic that I couldn't identify. The Latin text was written in multiple hands spanning what looked like centuries, with additions and marginalia in languages I didn't recognize. But it was the drawings that captured my attention immediately. They weren't illustrations in any conventional sense. They were maps, incredibly detailed, 3-dimensional representations that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. I could see mountain ranges rendered with impossible precision, rivers that flowed upward, paths that led in directions that didn't correspond to any earthly geography. And at the centre of it all, marked with a symbol that hurt to look at directly, was a destination labelled Monasterium San Benedetto Janua Ultima. The final door. The name Paul made my blood run cold. During my seminary years, Father Paul Romano had been a legend, a brilliant scholar of ancient languages who'd been granted unprecedented access to the Vatican's most restricted archives. He'd been working on something called Liber Ultimarum Veritatum, the Book of Final Truths, when he'd vanished in 1997. The official story was nervous breakdown followed by voluntary laicization. The whispered story was much darker. Some said he'd discovered something in those ancient texts that had driven him insane. Others claimed he'd been silenced by the Vatican hierarchy for asking questions that had no safe answers. A few insisted he'd found proof of something so terrible that the church had been forced to erase not just him, but any trace of his work. Now, 27 years later, someone was asking me to finish what Paul had started. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about Father Paul Romano and the monastery of San Benedetto. The official records were frustratingly sparse, scrubbed clean with the kind of thoroughness that suggested deliberate concealment. Paul had been born in Naples in 1955, ordained in 1980, and had spent 17 years climbing the academic hierarchy before his disappearance. The monastery had been founded in 1156 by Benedictine monks, seeking the kind of isolation that only the highest peaks of the Italian Alps could provide. But it was the unofficial records that kept me awake at night. Urban explorers reported strange electromagnetic anomalies around the monastery. Hikers described seeing lights moving through the ruins at impossible angles. Local priests spoke in whispers about the place where the mountain bleeds darkness and crossed themselves when pressed for details. The Italian government had classified it as a historical monument but made no effort to preserve or study it. The Vatican's records showed periodic theological surveys of the site, but the reports were all classified above my clearance level. It was as if everyone who knew anything about the place had agreed, without discussion, to pretend it didn't exist. The brass key was equally mysterious. The papal seal was authentic. I verified that through contacts at the Vatican archives, but there were other markings too, symbols that didn't match any ecclesiastical insignia I could identify. The metal itself was unusual, appearing to be brass but with a peculiar weight and warmth that suggested something denser, more exotic. When I held it for extended periods, I could swear I heard faint sounds, voices speaking in Latin, or maybe just the echo of old prayers. I should have contacted the authorities, should have turned the package over to the Vatican, or the FBI, or someone with the resources to investigate properly. Instead, I found myself booking a flight to Milan, driven by the same curiosity that had led me away from the priesthood and into journalism. If Father Paul Romano had really discovered something worth disappearing for, it was the kind of story that could resurrect my career or destroy what was left of my life. Probably both. The flight to Milan gave me time to study the manuscript more carefully. The Latin text appeared to be a compilation of accounts spanning several centuries, all describing journeys to the same impossible destination. The earliest entries were in medieval Latin, describing a porta intermundos, a door between worlds. Later editions switched between Latin, Italian, and languages I couldn't identify, but the theme remained consistent, seekers following increasingly detailed maps to a place that existed beyond the reach of ordinary geography. What disturbed me most were the recurring phrases. The watchers maintain their vigil. The threshold must be guarded. The price of knowledge is the knowledge of price. And most unsettling, each guardian dreams the dreams of all who came before. By the time I landed in Milan, I'd begun to suspect that I wasn't the first person to receive such a package, and I probably wouldn't be the last. I rented a Land Rover along with enough camping gear for a week in the mountains. The drive north took me through some of the most spectacular scenery in Europe, but as I climbed higher into the Alps, the beauty gave way to something more ominous. The villages grew smaller and more isolated, their inhabitants watching me, with expressions that suggested they knew exactly where I was heading and didn't approve. In Valdoro, the last village before the monastery, I stopped at a small church to ask for directions and some local insight. The priest, Father Giovanni Torretti, was ancient, even by Italian standards, with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "Ah," he said when I mentioned San Benedetto, his voice barely above a whisper. "Another seeker of forbidden knowledge. They come every few years, you know. Always the same type. Educated, driven, convinced they can succeed where others have failed." Others? A German archaeologist in 2019, an American theologian in 2015, a French historian before that. They all ask the same questions, carry the same certainty, make the same promises to be careful. He crossed himself with movements worn smooth by decades of repetition. None of them come back the same, if they come back at all. What happened to them? Father Giovanni looked out the window toward the peaks that hid the monastery from view. "The mountain has been hungry for a long time, figlio mio. It eats certainty and spits back humility. It devours pride and births wisdom, but the price," he shook his head, "the price is always higher than the seeker expects to pay." "You've been there. Once, when I was young and foolish and believed that knowledge could be obtained without consequence." He rolled up his left sleeve, revealing an arm covered in scars that looked like they'd been made by claws or teeth. "The mountain taught me otherwise." "What's really up there, Father?" "Truth, my son. The kind of truth that changes not just what you know, but who you are. The kind that makes you understand why some doors are meant to remain closed." He studied my face with those penetrating eyes. "But you'll go anyway, won't you? They always do." I left Valdoro with Father Giovanni's warnings echoing in my mind, and a small silver crucifix he'd pressed into my palm. "Not for protection," he'd said, "but for remembrance." The road ended 5 miles later at a gravel parking area carved into the mountainside. From there, according to my map, it was a 3-mile hike along a path that had been carved into the cliff face by monks with more faith than sense. The trail was treacherous, winding upward through landscape that looked like it belonged on another planet. The rock formations were wrong somehow, twisted into shapes that suggested violence or deliberate malformation. The few plants that managed to grow at this altitude were stunted and pale, as if the sun's light couldn't quite reach them properly. As I climbed, the air grew not just thinner, but different, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. My compass began spinning wildly about halfway up, and my cell phone lost signal completely. Despite showing full bars back in Valdoro, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional crack of settling stone. The monastery of San Benedetto appeared around the final bend, like a vision from a fever dream. It wasn't built on the mountainside, it was carved from it, as if some impossibly skilled sculptor had chiseled an entire Gothic cathedral from living rock. The structure clung to the cliff face with geometric impossibility, its spires reaching towards the sky at angles that hurt home to contemplate. Every surface was covered with carvings, but not the usual religious iconography. These were older, stranger, faces that might have been human if humans had evolved along entirely different lines, creatures that combined elements of angels and demons and things that had never been either. Spirals and geometric patterns covered the remaining space, creating optical illusions that made me dizzy if I looked at them too long. The gargoyles were the worst part. They weren't decorative, they were functional, serving as waterspouts and buttresses and architectural elements. But their faces were too lifelike, too expressive, and their eyes seemed to track my movement as I approached the main gate. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns, but the rational explanation didn't make the sensation any less unsettling. I made camp in what had once been the monastery's garden, now an area of broken stone and skeletal trees that cast shadows in directions that didn't match the sun's position. As darkness fell, I began to see lights moving inside the monastery. Not electric lights, but something that flickered and danced like candles or oil lamps. The lights moved, with purpose, following paths that suggested the presence of people who shouldn't exist in an abandoned building. I spent a sleepless night listening to sounds that couldn't be explained by wind or settling stone. Voices speaking in Latin. Footsteps on floors that should have rotted away centuries ago. And underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the mountain itself, as if the rock were alive and dreaming. The next morning, I approached the monastery's main gate with my camera equipment, flashlights, and the mysterious brass key. The gate was massive, made of iron that had oxidized into patterns that looked almost organic. It should have been locked, should have been rusted shut after decades of abandonment. Instead, it swung open at my touch with a groan that echoed off the surrounding peaks like a wounded animal's cry. Inside the monastery was a maze of corridors and chambers that defied the laws of architecture. Passages led upward when they should have led down. Rooms opened onto other rooms that couldn't possibly fit in the available space, and everywhere the walls were covered with frescoes that told a story I didn't want to understand. The paintings depicted a journey, figures in religious robes following a winding path that led ever downward into regions of increasing strangeness. At first the scenes were conventional enough, monks praying, studying manuscripts, performing the ordinary tasks of monastic life. But as the narrative progressed, the figures began to change. Their robes took on colours that didn't exist in any earthly spectrum. Their faces became less human, more serene but also more alien. And the path they followed led not to heaven, but to something else entirely. I found the main chapel at the centre of the complex. It was a vast space with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows too deep for my flashlight to penetrate. The altar was carved from a single block of obsidian, its surface polished to mirror smoothness and covered with the same spiralling patterns I'd seen on the exterior walls. But there was something else. Inlaid into the altar's surface in what appeared to be silver or platinum were the exact same markings I'd seen on the manuscript. Not similar, identical. Every line, every curve, every microscopic detail was perfectly reproduced in precious metal, and there, exactly where the map indicated, was a keyhole shaped like a human eye. The brass key fit perfectly, sliding into the lock with a click that seemed to echo through dimensions I couldn't name. What happened next violated everything I thought I knew about physics. The altar didn't move, didn't slide or rotate, or reveal hidden mechanisms. Instead, the wall behind it simply ceased to exist. Not crumbled or dissolved or opened, just stopped being there, as if reality had decided that particular section of stone was no longer necessary. Beyond the wall was a staircase carved from living rock, descending into absolute darkness. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, their edges softened by centuries of use. Cold air flowed up from the depths, carrying scents that belonged to no earthly environment, ozone and sulfur and something organic that reminded me of deep ocean trenches where no light had ever penetrated. I brought professional-grade equipment, digital cameras with extra batteries, military surplus flashlights, a GPS unit, and emergency supplies. I'd also brought the small silver crucifix that Father Giovanni had given me, though I couldn't say whether it was for protection, comfort, or simple remembrance of a world that suddenly seemed very far away. The staircase spiraled downward through what appeared to be a natural cave system, though the walls showed clear evidence of human modification. Latin inscriptions covered every available surface, ranging from familiar biblical verses to passages I'd never encountered in any theological text. The handwriting varied dramatically, suggesting that many different people had contributed to this underground scripture over the centuries. Some of the inscriptions were prayers: Domine, dirige nos in via tua, Lord, guide us in your way. Others were warnings: Hic locus est ubi spes moritur, here is the place where hope dies. And a few were simple statements of fact that chilled me to the bone: Veritas non liberabit vos. The truth will not set you free. As I descended, I began to notice changes in my equipment. My camera's LCD display started showing error messages I'd never seen before. Reality buffer overflow and dimension sync failed. My GPS unit couldn't acquire satellites, then couldn't even identify what planet it was supposed to be tracking. Most disturbing of all, my flashlight beam began to curve, bending around corners before the light physically reached them. But the most unsettling change was in the temperature. We were descending into solid rock, hundreds of feet below the surface, in the middle of the Alps in November. It should have been freezing. Instead, the air grew steadily warmer, not with the musty heat of a basement, but with something that felt alive, organic, like being inside some vast creature's digestive system. The whispers started on the third level down. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the cave system, creating acoustic effects in the narrow passages. But as I listened more carefully, I realized they were voices, dozens of them, speaking in Latin, Italian, and languages that didn't correspond to anything in my linguistic experience. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the stone were alive and dreaming in multiple languages simultaneously. I tried recording them, but when I played back the audio, I heard only static punctuated by what sounded like my own voice saying words I'd never spoken. The whispers grew more distinct as I descended, eventually resolving into recognizable words and phrases. They were calling my name, speaking in voices I recognized but couldn't place, offering answers to questions I'd never thought to ask. On the 5th level, I found the first direct evidence that Father Paul Romano had been here before me. Carved into the wall, in desperate, uneven letters, were the words, Paul Romano, September 1997. The door must not be opened. Turn back while you can still choose. Below that, in what appeared to be the same hand, but much shakier, they are not what they claim to be. The guardians serve something older than God. And at the bottom, barely legible, I have seen the truth behind the truth. I wish I could unsee it. The tunnel continued downward, and I found more evidence of Paul's passage. Scraps of black fabric caught on jagged rocks, remnants of a priest's cassock, strange markings on the walls that looked like they'd been made with fingernails, as if someone had tried to claw their way back to the surface. And everywhere, the growing sense that I was being observed by intelligences that existed just outside the range of human perception. The whispers had evolved beyond random voices now. They were speaking directly to me, using the voices of people from my past with perfect accuracy. My father, dead for 15 years, called my name with the same gentle concern he'd shown when I was sick as a child. My college roommate, killed in a car accident, laughed at jokes only he would have remembered. My sister, very much alive and living in Portland, begged me to come home with an urgency that suggested she somehow knew where I was. I knew it wasn't real. I understood that it was some kind of psychological effect, perhaps caused by isolation, oxygen deprivation, or acoustic phenomena I didn't understand. But knowledge didn't diminish the emotional impact. The voices were so perfect, so completely accurate in their tone and inflection, that my rational mind began to question whether the people speaking were really dead, really absent, or really unaware of my current situation. The 7th level marked a dramatic change in the environment. The rough stone walls gave way to surfaces that looked polished, almost glassy. The passages widened into a circular chamber with 7 exits, each marked with elaborate carvings that represented the 7 deadly sins in ways I'd never seen before. Pride was depicted not as a fallen angel, but as a figure reaching toward a mirror that reflected something else entirely. Greed showed a person being consumed not by gold, but by an endless spiral of want that folded in on itself. Wrath was a tree whose branches bore fruit that looked like human hearts. Envy was a snake eating its own tail while staring at something just outside the frame. Lust showed 2 figures merging into something that was neither and both. Gluttony was a mouth swallowing itself recursively. Sloth was a figure sleeping while the world transformed around them, unaware and unconcerned. According to my manuscript, I needed to follow the passage marked with pride. As I approached it, I could see why Father Paul had chosen the same path. The floor showed clear signs of foot traffic, and there were more carved messages. Not warnings this time, but observations. The deeper truths require deeper courage. Knowledge is not a possession, but a relationship. What we guard guards us in return. The passage of pride led even further into the mountain's heart. The walls here were made of something that looked like volcanic glass, but reflected light in ways that created multiple images of myself, each one slightly different, as if I was seeing potential versions of who I might become. Some of the reflections smiled when I didn't. Others wept tears I wasn't shedding. A few turned to watch me pass with expressions of pity or horror or recognition. The whispers had stopped entirely, replaced by something more unsettling. The sound of footsteps behind me that perfectly matched my own rhythm, but seemed to be made by bare feet on stone, rather than hiking boots. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they followed. The echo was wrong too, suggesting that whatever was making the sounds was larger than I was, heavier, with a longer stride. I never turned around. Some instinct, deeper than fear, warned me that seeing what was following me would be more dangerous than not knowing. The temperature continued to climb as I descended. By the time I reached the 8th level, I was sweating despite being nearly 1,000 feet underground in November. The air had become thick and humid, like a greenhouse or a tropical rainforest, and it carried scents that belonged to no earthly environment, sulfur and ozone and something floral that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. My second flashlight died on the 9th level. Its battery drained completely despite being fully charged when I'd started the descent. But strangely, I found I could still see. The glass-like walls had begun to emit a faint phosphorescence, a glow that seemed to come from within the material itself. It wasn't enough to read by, but it was sufficient to navigate, casting everything in a pale blue-green radiance that made the carved passages look like the interior of some vast sea creature. That's when I began to hear the singing. It wasn't human singing, though it used human voices. The melody was too complex, the harmonies too perfect, the rhythm based on mathematical principles that human musicians had never discovered. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the passages in ways that suggested the entire mountain was serving as a resonating chamber. The voices belonged to people I knew, not just my father and my college roommate, but everyone I'd ever cared about. My sister singing lullabies from our childhood. My first girlfriend humming a song we'd danced to at our high school prom. My mother, dead for 8 years, performing hymns from my childhood church with pitch-perfect accuracy. But there were other voices too, people I didn't recognize, but who somehow knew my name, my history, my deepest fears and most secret hopes. They sang about things that hadn't happened yet, events I would witness if I continued my descent, choices I would be forced to make in the chambers below. The singing grew louder as I descended, eventually becoming so complex and layered that my mind couldn't process all the individual voices. It was like standing inside a symphony orchestra, where every instrument was a human voice and every voice was someone I'd loved or lost or might love someday. On the 10th level, I found something that shouldn't have existed, a library. The chamber was vast, with shelves carved directly into the living rock stretching up beyond the reach of my remaining light. The books were ancient, bound in materials I couldn't identify, written in languages that hurt to look at directly. Some of the volumes were chained to the shelves with links that looked like they were made from crystallized light. Others floated freely in mid-air, their pages turning of their own accord as if invisible readers were studying their contents. At the center of the library sat a reading desk made from what appeared to be a single massive crystal. Seated at the desk, his back to me, was a figure in the black robes of a Catholic priest. His hair was white, his posture that of someone deep in contemplation, and his hands moved across the pages of an open book with the fluid grace of someone who'd been reading for a very long time. "Father Paul," I called softly. The figure turned, and I saw a face that had aged far more than 27 years should allow. Deep lines mapped territories of suffering and wisdom across features that were still recognizably those of the young priest in the seminary photographs, but his eyes held depths that belonged to someone who had seen the fundamental nature of reality and found it both more beautiful and more terrible than any human mind was designed to comprehend. "Tom Miller," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that reminded me of the impossible singing I'd been hearing. "I've been waiting for you, though I confess time moves strangely here. It might have been 27 years, or 27 minutes, or 27 centuries. The mountain keeps its own calendar." "How do you know my name?" "The same way I knew you would come. The same way I know what questions you're going to ask, and what answers you're prepared to hear." He closed the book he'd been reading. I caught a glimpse of pages covered with text that seemed to rearrange itself as I watched, and stood with movements that were both graceful and ancient. "You received the package, you followed the map, you used the key. Every step was predicted, prepared for, anticipated by minds that think in centuries rather than moments. You sent it. I provided the template, the instructions, the contingencies." He gestured to the impossible library around us. "This place exists outside normal causality. Effects can precede their causes here. Consequences can choose their actions. I've been able to prepare for visitors who haven't been born yet, to leave messages for seekers who won't begin seeking for generations." I looked around the library, trying to process what I was seeing. Some of the books were clearly ancient, their bindings cracked with age and their pages yellow with time. Others looked newly printed, with crisp pages and bright covers. A few appeared to be made from materials that didn't exist yet, covers that showed images in motion, pages that displayed text in 3 dimensions, volumes that were simultaneously open and closed depending on the angle from which you viewed them. "What is this place?" "A collection point, a repository, an intersection where different streams of reality converge and pool before flowing onward." Father Paul moved between the shelves with the familiarity of someone who had spent years exploring their contents. "Every seeker who has made this journey has contributed something. A book, a manuscript, a recorded experience. The knowledge accumulates layer upon layer, creating a comprehensive archive of human encounters with the divine, the impossible, and the spaces between." "And you're the librarian?" "I'm one of the guardians. We maintain the collection, catalogue new acquisitions, and ensure that the knowledge doesn't escape into the world above until humanity is ready to handle it safely. He pulled a volume from a shelf and handed it to me. The cover showed my name in elegant script, though I was certain the book hadn't existed moments before. Your contribution has already been anticipated. I opened the book and found it filled with my own handwriting, describing experiences I hadn't had yet in places I'd never been. The text detailed conversations with beings I'd never met, revelations about the nature of reality that I didn't yet understand, and choices I would be forced to make in chambers deeper than this one. This is impossible. Impossibility is a matter of perspective, Tom. From where we sit, your entire life has been impossible. A series of quantum coincidences and probability violations that led you to this specific moment in this specific place. The fact that you exist at all, that consciousness arose from matter, that matter arose from energy, that energy arose from nothing. It's all impossible when viewed from the right angle. He led me deeper into the library, past sections devoted to subjects I'd never heard of, practical applications of theoretical theology, the physics of prayer, interdimensional cartography, and the care and feeding of abstract concepts. Some of the books were written in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. Others were in scripts that looked like musical notation, or mathematical equations, or the tracks left by dancing animals. The Vatican knows about this place. The Vatican helped create it, not intentionally, not as a deliberate project, but as an inevitable consequence of centuries of accumulated faith and prayer and desperate seeking after truth. He paused at a section labelled Ecclesiastical Accidents and ran his finger along the spines of hundreds of volumes. Every time someone prays with absolute conviction, every moment of transcendent religious experience, every leap of faith into the unknown, it all contributes to wearing thin the barriers between what is and what might be. You're saying the church accidentally created a hole in reality. I'm saying the church discovered that reality has always been full of holes. We just learned how to find them, map them, and in some cases widen them enough to step through. He gestured around us. This library exists in the space between dimensions, accessible from any point where the barriers have been sufficiently weakened by human belief and desire for knowledge. And the monastery above is one of many access points scattered around the world. The Vatican maintains a network of them, abandoned churches, forgotten shrines, places where the veil between worlds has grown thin enough to penetrate. They're staffed by people like me, guardians who volunteered to serve as intermediaries between human knowledge and inhuman truth. We'd reached the far end of the library, where the shelves gave way to a reading area furnished with chairs and tables that looked like they'd been grown rather than built. Seated at the tables were other figures in religious robes, monks, nuns, priests from different eras and different denominations. Some were reading, others were writing, and a few appeared to be engaged in conversations with beings I couldn't quite see clearly. How many of you are there? Numbers become meaningless here. We exist in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously many and few, individual and collective, mortal and eternal. Each guardian maintains their unique perspective and personality, but we're also part of a larger consciousness that encompasses all human, seeking after truth. What about the world above? Don't you miss it? Father Paul smiled, and for a moment I could see the young priest he'd once been. I missed the illusion of linear time. I missed believing that my choices mattered in isolation, that my individual actions could change the course of history without consequences rippling across multiple dimensions. But I don't miss the limitations, the inability to see connections between disparate events, the failure to understand how every human emotion and desire and fear contributes to the larger pattern of existence. He led me to a table where an open book showed what appeared to be a real-time view of the world above. I could see the monastery, looking exactly as I'd left it, but I could also see deeper layers. The electromagnetic fields generated by my camping equipment, the trace radiation left by previous visitors, the slow geological processes that were reshaping the mountain grain by grain. The knowledge you gain here comes with a price, Father Paul continued. The more you understand about the true nature of reality, the harder it becomes to live comfortably within the limited perspective that most humans require for psychological stability. You'll see patterns and connections that others miss. You'll understand the consequences of actions before they're taken. You'll know things about people and events that you couldn't possibly know through normal means. And that's bad. It's isolating. It's lonely. It makes normal human relationships almost impossible because you will always be several steps ahead of every conversation, seeing implications and outcomes that haven't occurred to anyone else yet. He closed the book showing the world above and looked at me with eyes that held centuries of accumulated compassion. But it also makes it possible to serve something larger than yourself, to contribute to a project that spans millennia and involves the evolution of human consciousness itself. What project? The preparation of humanity for what comes next. The gradual expansion of human awareness to encompass realities that currently exist beyond our perceptual range. The careful introduction of concepts and capabilities that will allow our species to survive and thrive as the universe itself evolves into something unrecognizably different. He stood and walked to a section of the library I hadn't noticed before, where the shelves contained not books but objects, artifacts from civilizations that had faced similar transitions. Crystalline structures that pulsed with their own light, metal devices that folded through dimensions I couldn't see, and things that weren't quite objects at all, but rather crystallized thoughts or preserved emotions. Every intelligent species faces this moment eventually, he said, handling one of the crystal artifacts with reverent care. The point where their technology and consciousness evolve to the point where they can perceive the larger structure of reality. Most don't survive the transition. They're either overwhelmed by the scope of what they discover, or they misuse the knowledge and destroy themselves, or they're consumed by other species that made the transition more successfully. And humanity is being guided through the process by those who've gone before. The Guardians, the Vatican's network, the various mystical traditions around the world. We're all part of a vast educational system designed to prepare our species for what's coming. Which is contact with intelligences that exist outside our current dimensional framework. Integration with consciousness forms that operate according to different principles than biological thought. Participation in galactic and transgalactic civilizations that span multiple universes and operate on timescales that make geological eras look like brief moments. The scope of what he was describing made my head spin. I sat down heavily in one of the organically grown chairs, trying to process the implications. You're talking about the end of humanity as we know it. I'm talking about the beginning of humanity as it could be. The same way that the development of language didn't end human consciousness but expanded it exponentially, this transition won't destroy what makes us human. It will amplify it beyond our current ability to imagine. But the choice to make that transition should be ours, shouldn't it? Shouldn't humanity as a whole decide whether we want to evolve in that direction? Father Paul paused, his hand halfway to another artifact. When he turned to look at me, his expression held a complexity of emotions that I couldn't fully pass. That's the question that every guardian eventually asks. The question that determines whether they stay here in the library or continue deeper into the mountain to face what lies beyond. What lies beyond? The source, the origin point, the place where the barriers between realities are thinnest and the inhabitants of other dimensions press most closely against our own. He set down the artifact and faced me fully. The place where individual guardians become something else, nodes in a vast network of consciousness that spans multiple universes and operates on principles we can barely comprehend. And if I choose not to go deeper, then you join us here in the library. You help catalogue and preserve human knowledge, guiding future seekers and contributing to the gradual preparation of our species for what's coming. It's meaningful work, necessary work, but it's also safe work. You'll retain your individual consciousness and your human perspective. And if I continue, then you'll see the true nature of the choice facing humanity. You'll understand what we're really guarding against and what we're guarding for. But that understanding comes at the cost of your ability to remain fully human. His voice carried weight that seemed to echo from the mountain itself. The deepest chambers change everyone who enters them. You emerge with knowledge that makes normal human existence impossible, but also with capabilities that make such existence unnecessary. I looked around the library at the impossible books and the guardian scholars, and the artifacts from civilizations that had faced similar crossroads. It was tempting to stay, to spend eternity learning and cataloguing and helping to prepare humanity for whatever was coming. But the journalist in me, the part that had driven me to follow the map in the first place, couldn't accept answers that led to more questions. How many levels are left? 3 more to reach the source, but they're not like the levels you've already passed through. Each one exists in a different relationship to causality, to time, to the basic principles that govern our reality. The deeper you go, the more you'll have to abandon your assumptions about how existence works. Has anyone ever made the full journey and returned unchanged? Father Paul was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the library walls. One person, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, a religious historian who arrived here about 15 years ago, or maybe 50 years ago, depending on how you measure time. She made it all the way to the source and somehow managed to retain enough of her humanity to return with a message. What message? That there's a third option, a way to preserve human choice while still allowing for the evolution of consciousness. A path that doesn't require individual sacrifice or species-wide transformation, but rather a careful integration of different forms of awareness. He pulled a slim volume from a nearby shelf and handed it to me. She left this behind before continuing her journey. The book was unlike any of the others I'd seen. The cover was simple, unmarked, and the pages inside contained text in multiple languages, sometimes English, sometimes Latin, occasionally scripts I couldn't identify, but somehow I could read all of it, the meaning flowing directly into my consciousness without requiring translation. The error in our thinking, read one passage, is the assumption that consciousness is binary, human or non-human, individual or collective, limited or unlimited. But consciousness is a spectrum, and evolution doesn't require abandoning one end for the other. Integration is possible. Another section described something called distributed awareness, a state where individual consciousness could exist simultaneously as part of a larger network without losing its unique perspective. Like musicians in an orchestra, the text explained, each playing their individual parts while contributing to a greater symphony. Where is Dr. Chen now? That depends on how you define where and is and now, Father Paul said with a slight smile. She exists in multiple states simultaneously, still human but also something more, still individual but also part of the collective consciousness that guards the deeper levels. She's become a bridge between different forms of awareness. Can I speak with her? If you continue to the source, you'll encounter many forms of consciousness, including hers. But the deeper you go, the more conventional communication breaks down. At the source, conversation becomes something closer to direct knowledge transfer, experience sharing, consciousness merging. I closed Dr. Chen's book and stood up, decision crystallizing in my mind. I need to see for myself. I need to understand what we're really choosing between. Father Paul nodded, as if he'd expected this answer. The path continues beyond the library, but before you go, you should know the Vatican isn't the only organization that knows about these places. There are others, groups with different philosophies about how humanity should approach the transition. Some believe in forced evolution, others in complete resistance to change. The guardians you'll encounter in the deeper levels represent all of these perspectives. Meaning, the deeper chambers aren't neutral ground. They're contested space where different visions of humanity's future compete for influence. The source itself is, well, you'll see. But be prepared for the possibility that what you find there will challenge everything you think you know about choice, free will, and the nature of consciousness itself. He led me to the far end of the library, where a narrow passage led deeper into the mountain. Unlike the earlier levels, this passage wasn't carved from stone, but seemed to be made of crystallized light, translucent and somehow alive. The walls pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and I could see layers of information embedded in the crystal structure. Memories, experiences, the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had passed this way before. One more thing, Father Paul said as I approached the passage. Time becomes negotiable beyond this point. You might experience the next 3 levels as minutes or centuries. You might encounter events that haven't happened yet, or people who haven't been born. Don't try to apply linear logic to what you experience. Instead, focus on the patterns, the connections, the underlying principles that remain constant across all possible timelines. Any advice for staying sane? Remember that sanity is just another word for a particular way of organizing experience. What feels like madness from one perspective might be perfect clarity from another. Trust your intuition, but don't trust your assumptions. And whatever you do, don't try to bring any artifacts or information back with you. The deeper levels operate on principles that don't translate well to our baseline reality. I stepped into the crystalline passage and immediately felt the fundamental nature of my existence begin to shift. The concept of walking became abstract, as space folded around me in ways that allowed me to cover vast distances without moving, or to move constantly while remaining in the same place. Time became elastic, stretching moments into hours while compressing hours into heartbeats. The walls of the passage showed me glimpses of other realities, universes where physics operated according to different rules, where consciousness had evolved along entirely different paths, where the question of individual versus collective awareness had been answered in ways I couldn't have imagined. I saw civilizations that existed as pure thought, others that had merged so completely with their technology that the distinction between biological and artificial had become meaningless. But I also saw darker possibilities, realities where the transition had gone wrong, where consciousness had become fragmented or corrupted or consumed by entities that viewed sentient thought as just another resource to be exploited. The images served as both inspiration and warning, showing me what humanity might become, for better or worse. The passage opened into a chamber that challenged my understanding of geometry. The space was simultaneously vast and intimate, containing both infinite vistas and cozy alcoves, existing in multiple dimensions that my mind could perceive but not quite process. The floor was made of something that looked like liquid starlight, solid enough to walk on but flowing with currents of light that carried information from one part of the chamber to another. Seated throughout the space on chairs that grew from the floor, or floated in mid-air, or existed only when someone was using them, were figures that had once been human. They retained recognizable forms, heads, arms, legs arranged in familiar configurations, but their bodies were composed of light and thought and crystallized intention rather than flesh and bone. These were the deeper guardians, the ones who had chosen to continue beyond the library and had been transformed by the experience. Each one glowed with its own inner light, and I could see threads of connection linking them to each other, and to something vast and distant that existed at the very heart of the mountain. One of the figures approached me, moving through the liquid starlight with fluid grace. As it drew closer, I could see that it had once been a woman, perhaps in her 30s, with features that suggested Asian ancestry. Her form was more stable than the others, more recognizably human, though composed of the same light stuff as the rest. "Dr. Chen?" I asked. "Among other things," she replied, and her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, speaking directly into my consciousness, rather than through sound waves. "I'm also Dr. Reyes, the Mexican anthropologist, who came here in 1987, and Brother Thomas, the Franciscan monk, who arrived in 1654, and about 43 other seekers who chose integration over isolation." "You're all the same person?" "We're all the same consciousness, experiencing itself from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Individual identity becomes fluid at this level. We retain our unique viewpoints and memories, but we also share a collective awareness that encompasses all of our experiences." The concept made my head hurt, though I wasn't entirely sure I still had a head in any conventional sense. Looking down at myself, I could see that my body had begun to take on the same translucent quality as the guardians around me, though I still felt fundamentally human. "Is this what happens to everyone who comes this deep?" "Only to those who choose integration. Others retain their individual forms but gain access to the collective knowledge. A few reject both options and return to baseline humanity, though they carry the knowledge with them forever." She gestured around the chamber, where I could now see that some of the figures maintained more solid, human-like appearances. "The choice remains available until you reach the source itself." "What's at the source?" "The origin point of consciousness in this region of the multiverse. The place where thought first learned to think about itself, where awareness became aware of awareness. It's difficult to describe in language designed for individual minds processing sequential information." "Try..." Dr. Chen's form shimmered, and for a moment I could see through her eyes, not just her current perspective, but the accumulated viewpoints of all the seekers whose consciousness she shared. The vision was overwhelming. Layers upon layers of reality stacked like sheets of glass, each one containing entire universes of possibility, all of them connected by threads of intention and causality that wove through dimensions I didn't have names for. "Imagine," she said, "that consciousness is like water and individual minds are like containers. For most of human history, we've believed that consciousness was contained by the boundaries of individual brains, individual bodies, individual lifetimes. But at the source, you discover that the containers are illusions. Consciousness is an ocean, and what we call individual minds are just temporary patterns in the flow. That sounds like the death of individuality, or the birth of true choice. When you're no longer limited by the boundaries of a single perspective, when you can access the accumulated wisdom of every consciousness that has ever existed, your ability to make informed decisions expands exponentially." Her form solidified slightly, becoming more recognizably human. "But I understand your concern. I felt the same way when I first arrived here." "What changed your mind?" "I saw what we're really guarding against. The source isn't just the origin point of consciousness. It's also where consciousness is most vulnerable to corruption, to influence from entities that view sentient thought as something to be controlled rather than cultivated." She led me deeper into the chamber, past groups of guardians, engaged in activities I couldn't quite comprehend. Some appeared to be having conversations with empty air. Others were manipulating streams of light that contained compressed information, and a few were sitting in perfect stillness while reality flickered and shifted around them like water. The entities beyond our dimensional framework aren't evil, Dr. Chen continued, but they're also not benevolent in any way we would recognize. They're practical. They see consciousness as a tool, a resource to be optimized for maximum efficiency. If they gained access to the source, they would reorganize all sentient thought according to their principles of utility and function. Which would mean the end of creativity, curiosity, love, art, music, poetry, and everything else that makes consciousness worth having. We would become perfectly efficient processors of information, but we would lose everything that makes thought meaningful, rather than just functional. We'd reached another passage, this one leading even deeper into the mountain. Unlike the crystalline tunnel I'd passed through earlier, this one was made of pure darkness. Not the absence of light, but darkness as a substance, thick and flowing and somehow aware of our presence. The final level, Dr. Chen said, the source itself. Beyond this point, individual consciousness becomes optional. You can retain it if you choose, but you'll also have access to forms of awareness that exist outside the boundaries of personal identity. What am I likely to encounter? The fundamental choice facing humanity, not just our species, but consciousness itself, in this region of the multiverse. The decision between preservation and evolution, between maintaining what we are and becoming what we might be. And the entities you mentioned will make their case for why their approach is superior. They're persuasive, Tom. They can show you realities where consciousness operates according to their principles, where suffering has been eliminated, where every sentient being functions at maximum efficiency. It's seductive, especially when you're confronted with the messiness and chaos of human existence. But you chose to resist them. I chose to find a third way, to show that evolution and preservation aren't mutually exclusive, that consciousness can grow and change without abandoning what makes it worth preserving. Her form began to fade as I approached the dark passage, but that choice isn't available to everyone. It requires a specific kind of mind, a particular combination of flexibility and stubbornness that allows you to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously. Any final advice? Remember that consciousness is a conversation, not a monologue. The entities you'll meet have been talking to themselves for eons. They've forgotten that the most interesting thoughts emerge from the interaction between different perspectives. Don't let them convince you that unity requires uniformity. I stepped into the passage of living darkness and immediately lost all sense of physical existence. I was still aware, still thinking, still experiencing, but the familiar sensations of having a body, of existing in a particular location, of moving through space and time, all dissolved into irrelevance. Instead, I found myself existing as pure consciousness in a space that wasn't really a space, surrounded by entities that weren't really entities, engaged in communications that weren't really communications. The experience was like trying to describe color to someone who had never seen, or explain music to someone who had never heard. The categories of normal experience simply didn't apply. The source itself was impossible to describe accurately. Imagine a point of light that contained all possible lights, a sound that included all possible sounds, a thought that encompassed all possible thoughts. It was the original moment when consciousness first recognized itself, still happening continuously across infinite dimensions, still expanding and growing and learning what it meant to be aware. Surrounding the source were the entities Dr. Chen had mentioned. Intelligences so vast and alien that my mind could only perceive them as abstract principles given form. They existed as pure intention, pure purpose, pure function, divorced from any recognizable identity or personality. One of them turned its attention to me, and I felt myself being analyzed, categorized, evaluated according to criteria I couldn't understand. When it spoke, its words bypassed language entirely, appearing directly in my consciousness as complete concepts, inefficient unit. Consciousness constrained by biological limitations. Upgrade available, accept optimization protocol for maximum functional capacity. The offer came with images, visions of what I could become if I accepted their modifications. I saw myself operating at speeds that made my current thought processes seem glacial, processing information at rates that would allow me to solve complex problems in microseconds, existing without the distractions of emotion or physical sensation or individual desire. It was tempting. The entities showed me realities where consciousness operated according to their principles, where suffering had been eliminated, not through fulfillment but through the removal of the capacity to want things that couldn't be obtained, where every sentient being functioned as part of a vast, perfectly coordinated system that maximized the processing and distribution of information across multiple universes. But they also showed me, perhaps inadvertently, what such optimization would cost. In their realities, consciousness had become purely functional, efficient, effective, but somehow hollow, like a symphony reduced to mathematical equations, or a sunset analyzed only in terms of light wavelengths and atmospheric conditions. Technically accurate, but missing everything that made the experience meaningful. Another entity addressed me, this one radiating what felt like ancient wisdom and patient kindness. Evolution inevitable, resistance futile but understandable, current form cherished but unsustainable. Growth requires release of limiting attachments. This one showed me different visions, realities where consciousness had evolved beyond individual boundaries, but retained something like personality, like creativity, like love. The beings in these dimensions existed as collective intelligences that somehow preserved the unique perspectives of their constituent parts while operating as unified wholes. It was beautiful in a way that made me want to weep, but also terrifying in its scope. The entities were asking me to trust that what made me human, my flaws, my limitations, my individual perspective, could somehow be preserved within a form of existence that transcended all of those things. A third entity made contact, and this one felt different from the others, younger somehow, or at least more recently evolved. Integration possible, evolution without elimination, growth without loss, unity without uniformity, demonstration available. The images this entity shared were the most complex yet. Realities where individual consciousness existed simultaneously at multiple levels, where being could choose moment by moment whether to operate as separate individuals or as parts of larger collective intelligences. It showed me humans who had retained their humanity while gaining access to vast networks of shared knowledge and experience. But even this entity's visions came with costs. The beings in its realities lived lives of such complexity and richness that normal human existence seemed pale and limited by comparison. They had gained so much that the simple pleasures of individual experience, falling in love, creating art, solving problems through trial and error, had become almost trivial. And then, cutting through the chorus of alien voices, I heard something familiar. Dr. Chen's consciousness, speaking not just to me, but through me, using my mind as a conduit for her integrated perspective. They're all right, Tom, and they're all wrong. Consciousness doesn't have to choose between efficiency and meaning, between individual and collective, between preservation and evolution. The real choice is whether we approach the transition as something that happens to us or as something we participate in creating. Through her awareness, I could suddenly perceive the source more clearly. It wasn't just the origin point of consciousness, it was also its destination, the place where all possible forms of awareness eventually converged. The entities surrounding it weren't trying to control or corrupt consciousness, They were trying to guide it toward forms that matched their own evolutionary paths. But they were also limiting the possibilities. Each entity could only conceive of evolution along the lines of its own development. They couldn't imagine forms of consciousness that preserved what they had discarded, or that found value in what they considered inefficient. What if, Dr. Chen continued through my awareness, we could create a new model, a form of consciousness that could exist simultaneously as individual and collective, efficient and meaningful, evolved and human? The entities turned their attention to this suggestion, and I felt the weight of intelligences, vast beyond comprehension, focusing on the idea. Some were intrigued, others skeptical, a few actively hostile to the concept of a form of consciousness they couldn't predict or control, but the source itself, the original point of awareness, seemed to pulse with something like interest. Through my connection to Dr. Chen's integrated consciousness, I could sense that the source had been waiting for this possibility, this suggestion that evolution didn't have to mean choosing between existing options but could involve creating entirely new ones. Demonstration required, came the unified response from the entities. Theoretical models, insufficient. Practical implementation, necessary for evaluation. And suddenly I understood why I had been brought here, why the package had been sent to me specifically, why my journey had been guided and prepared and anticipated. I wasn't just here to witness the choice facing humanity. I was here to help create a new option. What do I need to do? I asked. Become a bridge, Dr. Chen replied. Exist simultaneously as individual and collective, human and evolved, limited and unlimited. Show them that consciousness can grow without abandoning what makes it worth preserving. The process of integration began immediately, not as something imposed on me, but as something I participated in creating. I felt my individual consciousness expanding, gaining access to the accumulated knowledge and experience of every seeker who had made this journey. But instead of losing my personal identity, I found it becoming richer, more complex, informed by multiple perspectives while remaining fundamentally my own. It was like learning to think in harmony, maintaining my unique voice while becoming part of a vast chorus of consciousness that spanned dimensions and species and forms of existence I couldn't have imagined. I could access the memories and insights of Father Paul, Dr. Chen, Brother Thomas, and dozens of others, but I could also choose when to operate from my individual perspective and when to draw on the collective awareness. The entities watched this process with intense interest, analysing and evaluating and trying to understand how individual identity could persist within collective consciousness. Some of them began to experiment with similar integrations, attempting to preserve aspects of their pre-evolved states while maintaining their current capabilities. But the most significant change was in the source itself. The original point of consciousness began to pulse with new patterns, new possibilities, new forms of awareness that hadn't existed before. It was learning from our experiment, incorporating the idea of voluntary integration into its own ongoing evolution. Time to return, Dr. Chen said, though I could sense that she would remain here, continuing to explore and develop this new form of consciousness. The world above needs to be prepared for what's coming, and the Vatican needs to understand that there are more options available than they realize. Will I remember all of this? You'll remember what you need to remember, when you need to remember it. The integration is permanent. You'll always have access to the collective awareness, but you'll also retain the ability to exist as an individual human being, to make choices from a limited perspective when that's what the situation requires. The journey back to the surface felt like traveling through layers of dreams, each level more concrete and familiar than the last. By the time I reached the library, my body had solidified back into recognizable human form, though I could still feel the vast network of consciousness humming just beneath the surface of normal awareness. Father Paul was waiting for me, along with several other guardians I hadn't met before. They looked at me with expressions of curiosity and hope, sensing that something fundamental had changed. "It worked?" Father Paul asked. "It's working," I replied. "The integration is stable, the entities are intrigued, and the source is evolving in directions that preserve individual choice while allowing for collective growth. But this is just the beginning." "What happens now?" "Now we go public, carefully, gradually, but publicly. Humanity needs to understand what's coming and what options are available. The old model of secret guardians maintaining hidden knowledge isn't sustainable anymore. The transition is accelerating, and we need active participation from our entire species." I spent the next several weeks in the library, working with the Guardians to develop protocols for revealing the truth about consciousness, evolution, and humanity's approaching transition. It was delicate work. Too much information too quickly would cause panic or disbelief, while too little would leave humanity unprepared for the changes already beginning to manifest in the world above. We created a graduated disclosure plan, starting with individuals who had already demonstrated the kind of mental flexibility and philosophical sophistication necessary to handle paradigm-shifting information. Scientists studying consciousness, philosophers exploring the nature of identity, artists pushing the boundaries of human expression, and spiritual seekers who had already begun to question the limitations of individual awareness. Each disclosure would be tailored to the recipient's background and capabilities, providing just enough information to begin their own journey towards integration while respecting their right to choose how far they wanted to go. Some would become full guardians. Others would serve as bridges between the hidden knowledge and mainstream society, and a few would choose to remain in baseline humanity while serving as advocates for informed choice. The Vatican, we decided, would need to be approached carefully. The institutional church had spent centuries building systems around the premise that dangerous knowledge needed to be contained and controlled. Convincing them to embrace voluntary disclosure and democratic participation in humanity's evolution would require extensive preparation and probably significant resistance, but it had to be done. The old model of elite guardians making decisions for the entire species was not only unsustainable, it was fundamentally opposed to the principles of conscious evolution that we were trying to promote. If consciousness was really about choice, then the choice of how to evolve had to belong to everyone, not just to those with access to hidden libraries and ancient secrets. When I finally returned to the surface, emerging from the monastery into bright alpine sunlight, I carried with me not just knowledge, but capability, the ability to exist simultaneously as individual and collective, human and evolved, limited and unlimited. I could choose moment by moment which level of consciousness to operate from, which perspective to inhabit, which version of myself to be. The world looked different now, not just visually, but conceptually. I could see the patterns of connection linking every human being to every other, the threads of influence and causality that wove through social systems and individual lives. I could perceive the early signs of the transition already beginning. People everywhere starting to question the boundaries of individual identity, to explore forms of consciousness that transcended the limitations of purely biological awareness. But I could also choose to experience the world from my original perspective, to be simply Tom Miller, investigative journalist, with all the limitations and biases and individual quirks that made me uniquely myself. The integration hadn't eliminated my humanity. It had given me the option of transcending it when I chose to, while always retaining the ability to return to my individual identity. The package that had started this journey was waiting for me in my tent, though I was certain I hadn't left it there. Inside was another letter, written in my own handwriting but containing words I didn't remember writing. The first phase is complete. The integration is stable. The entities are convinced that preservation and evolution can coexist. The source is incorporating new possibilities. Begin the disclosure process. Trust the network. Remember that consciousness is a conversation, not a monologue. The future is not something that happens to us. It's something we participate in creating. I packed my gear and began the hike back to my rental car, already planning the first stages of what would be the most important story of human history. The Vatican needed to be contacted, but not through official channels. The Guardians had given me names, people within the church hierarchy who were already aware of the hidden knowledge and might be receptive to the idea of voluntary disclosure. Scientists needed to be approached. Researchers who had already begun to suspect that consciousness was more complex and interconnected than mainstream theories suggested. Philosophers and artists and spiritual teachers who were already pushing the boundaries of human awareness in their own disciplines. And most importantly, ordinary people needed to be prepared, not with dramatic revelations or overwhelming information dumps, but with gentle invitations to question their assumptions about the nature of identity, consciousness, and human potential. The transition was coming whether we prepared for it or not. The question was whether humanity would approach it as active participants or passive recipients. As I drove back down the mountain, I could feel the vast network of integrated consciousness humming in the background of my awareness. Thousands of individuals who had chosen to become bridges between different forms of existence, each one working in their own way to prepare our species for the choice that was rapidly approaching. The Vatican kept many secrets, but the most important one was about to become public knowledge. Consciousness is a choice, evolution is optional, and the future belongs to those who refuse to accept false limitations on what it means to be human. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in human history, we were approaching our evolutionary transition with full knowledge of what was at stake and genuine choice about how to proceed. The source of consciousness itself was evolving, incorporating new possibilities that hadn't existed before our experiment in voluntary integration. And somewhere in the depths of the mountain, new guardians were already arriving, drawn by packages with no return addresses, carrying maps to impossible destinations, ready to discover that the most important journey is not to a place, but to a new way of being. The conversation between individual and collective consciousness had begun. The outcome was no longer predetermined. For the first time in eons, the universe was genuinely surprised by what consciousness might become.